Hi, and welcome to Ward 13. I'm John Hopwood. I'm joined by Jim O'Connell.
Hi, John. How are you?
We have Professor David Detmer back. And I have my copy of...
John.
Hi, I have my copy of A People's History of the United States. Now there's no more static, is there, Professor Detmer?
No, now it's fine.
Yeah, that's the Merrimack River, which Jack Kerouac wrote about, and many other people. I think that, didn't Thoreau write something about it?
Did he?
He's up here in the it's called Amoskeag.
Yeah, he did. I love that book, Into Maine Woods, and I just, I've been meaning often to go back and read it again because. Anyway, it's on my list to go back to. But if for people who, a lot of people, we just sort of live our lives. We drive up and down interstates and highways and look at concrete and all that stuff, and we forget that just a couple of generations ago it was wilderness.
Yeah.
And Thoreau, just a marvel of the idea, to marvel at the idea of getting in, canoes and dugouts and
you had to
way.
go through locks, and so he has to go through the locks.
In Thoreau's case, it was prior to locks even, because
really?
Yeah, because at this point there are dams that have been created, like beaver dams, that have flooded valleys, and it would allow them to travel then in the valley.
Sounds like Deadwood, the old series. Remember when it was just the buck-toothed beavers slapping their tails?
This is how it was. He goes up into Maine and travels up there. But he also the logging. The loggers would flood valleys during the period that they were logging, and then release it down the river. Once they were finished, they broke the log jam. And
that's right.
The man-made log jam, but he was able to. They traveled mostly by water, so it was like waterway. And there was portage to cross over certain places.
Okay, Jim, he's not writing about Thoreau, but okay. Thoreau was important to any American in the sense of.
Just in a sense
being a nonconformist, being an individual.
Right. I mean, these are the sort of foundational thoughts about America, right?
Yeah.
Everything from the Pilgrims onwards.
Also a major theoretician of civil disobedience.
That's right.
On civil disobedience, the name of one of his books, right?
That's right. Howard had us read that. But
yeah.
So
another wonderful Massachusetts man. So okay, good.
Yeah, we had an incident up here, Professor Detmer. We had somebody put some swastikas out.
Yeah, about two. Very sadly, in the night, sometime between Friday night and Sunday, there's an area. It's called Wagner or Wagner.
After
Park.
Wagner, the great anti-Semite, Semitic.
Not that Wagner. It was a family in Manchester who donated the land on which their house stood, and
we just go to
had it demolished and built a beautiful park. And there's a sort of what looks like a mausoleum, though it's not. A rotunda, a stone granite rotunda, and between Friday night and Sunday, somebody sprayed a swastika on it and then defiled it in other ways. But this is actually almost within sight of one of the local synagogues. It's less than 2 blocks from a synagogue, and then they spray painted cars and some other things. So it's very unfortunate given the weekend. It's unfortunate any time. But it brought that community, the Jewish community here in Manchester. 3 of the people who died in Pittsburgh had close associations with the Jewish community in Manchester. One of the people who died had actually been to the temple here in recent years. In any case, to have this terrible tragedy hit us as Americans, but then hit the Jewish community, in a greater way, and then to find that this particular incident, yes, absolutely, but then that this incident sort of happened a block and which is very unusual. It's not something that we've seen with any regularity, thankfully, but then to have this thing happen within a block and a half here in little old Manchester, New Hampshire, is very disturbing to local people.
But Professor Detmer, before his visa was taken away during the Obama administration, David Irving, the greatest Holocaust denier in the world, used to come to Manchester. He came here in November of 2013, and I had found out he had been here in 2011 also. So of all the places he'd go, like places like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia,
right.
he would come to Manchester, which has its own
I don't know, one of the things, Professor, I think that happens with Manchester is that because it's got the whole New Hampshire first in the nation status thing, Manchester for its size would have very little importance in politics otherwise, but because of the first in the nation thing, Manchester's main street, Queen Street, is awash in television cameras and crews and trucks and lights.
Because the presidential candidates are here all the time.
Every 4 years.
Not every 4 years, Jim. They're here already.
No, they come already, but it reaches a crescendo at the end of the 4 years. But all of the fourth year, there's hardly ever a time the tents and stay whatever they're called, platforms are put up and left up for months because people from CNN, ABC, CBS, Fox, whatever, they're all here, and so the candidates come here all the time. But that also brings out, for want of a word, I was going to say weirdos. I don't mean to be derogatory, but it brings out all the peripheral, the 1% of representing 1% of thought one place or another. They're born here by that possibility, and so Manchester ends up with national, or people trying to get national attention end up coming to the city of Manchester, where it's much easier to get some visibility in a city of 110,000 people than it is to get visibility in a city like Los Angeles.
See, we'll get to you, Professor Detmer, in a bit, because this is what's going on here. But this was Dave Scannell on the school board, the thing about Gerard, going after, they put, what's her name, Canfield or Banfield?
Miss Anne-Marie Banfield.
That she's not, so he's against the group Manchester Proud. But the point is people won't say, they call her conservative. She's an anti-gay activist. And Stinky Gerard was involved with the American Family Association, Wildman, which is considered an anti-hate group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. But nobody in Manchester will talk about these things. You try to talk about getting a human rights commission. Nobody will engage on that.
This is false New England politeness. This sort of.
No, it's not. But because they don't have it. Look what they're doing in other places. It's just Manchester is like it's like coming back. I was gone 38 years into a Twilight Zone episode. It's like, my God, But. It's like what I said on him. And then there's Joe Lavasser. This is a local alderman. We're tangentially involved in politics here, much to my detriment. Right. And then there's Joe Lavasser, who on his public access TV show mocked the rabbi who spoke at the 2018 inauguration. Nobody says anything about it.
What did
I
he say?
mentioned it.
I don't watch.
He said that it was gibberish. He's talking gibberish because he's speaking Hebrew. That is allowed here in Manchester. And the same Lavasser who defended the use of the N-word by a politician, and who I was told attacked Carol Shea Porter for being married to, quote-unquote, a black man. I did not see that show, but was told about it. I mean, the people here put up with this stuff. I don't understand.
Well, people have a ballot box, right? I mean, in the end,
they have a voice, because
right.
What Howard was about was activism. That he voted for Obama, but he says activism and people actually doing something. I'll let Dave Detmer take over here if you want to.
Well, sure, yeah. Howard certainly took the view that there's some value in voting, but really the far more important thing, as you point out, is activism, is activity to bring to the consciousness of the public injustices that are going on, and helping to change people's hearts and minds on crucial issues. And so when progressive change happens, that means eventually someone in power will sign a bill into law, or the Supreme Court will make a ruling, and they tend to get all the credit, but that will only happen once the way has been paved by activism. And of course, the other problem, as I'm sure you guys both know, is the two major parties pretty much just represent the interests of the rich. So sometimes there's a lesser evil, but still, it's not. For the most part, it's not the case that somebody's running who's really going to be looking out for your interests.
A Republican Party, it's got two wings. It's almost like two factions on a board of directors fighting it out.
The last time we were speaking, Professor, I lamented the fact that there was a lack of activism on our college campuses and in our colleges on behalf of the students, and I still I haven't heard a satisfactory explanation or observation about why that may be so. I think it is so.
Well, I don't know that I can give a completely satisfactory explanation, but I can say something about that. In the United States, the governments are providing less and less funding for higher education, for public universities. Tuition is rising and rising, and so students are graduating with massive debt, and for the first time, the prospects of the current generation, it looks unlikely that they're going to be as successful financially as their parents. And so I think a lot of students just have their nose to the grindstone trying to figure out how to get their life going, how to get through college without incurring massive debt, how to get a career started, and so on. I'm not trying to excuse it. I think they should take more political responsibility, but I think that's part of what's going on.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think there is truth to it, and it has consequences far beyond the lack of activism. There are real sort of life and economic effects to all of this, and I don't want to go down those rabbit holes, but we see that, for instance, in medicine, where 80% of medical students in the United States end up becoming specialists in one area or another, and less than 20% are general practitioners.
Yeah.
And part of the reason has to do with they need to be able to pay back those massive loans, and we see that, for instance, in
psychiatry. We don't have enough psychiatrists. It's the lowest paid field in medicine.
We see it though across the United States, and across the plains, and in less populated parts of the United States, where in rural America, general practitioners and doctors are harder and harder and harder to find.
Right. When Clinton was president and the VA didn't have the stress it does now because of these endless oil wars, which Steve Cohn, Dave Colapinto's partner, who wrote a book about draft resistance and resistors to conscription that goes back to colonial times. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't understand why there's no protest against the oil wars, but of course you don't get drafted.
I remember at the time of the beginning of the Iraq war, and when Rumsfeld was being asked how much it was going to cost, and he wouldn't give an answer, and there was no budget for it, of course, and they hadn't asked for an appropriation, so they're basically doing it on a credit card, so to speak. Of course, my children and yours credit card. But he was asked, first of all, the cost of that war, and one of the Brokaw or someone like that, or Peter Jennings, whoever was around at that time, said somebody quoted the number $85 million, and
it's $3 trillion after just a couple of years.
He poo-pooed the idea that it would be something greater than $100 million. But he was in the same conversation, he was challenged around the issue of the cost of the VA. And somebody had, some rudimentary calculation about for every, 100 troops you put in harm's way.
That's where the trillions were coming, because
there will be a lifelong
those
ongoing
obligations. But now they're privatizing it.
But the cost is still the same, right? For every 100,000 troops that were active, I don't know how many, 3 million, I think, troops or something have been active over the last 20 years. But each one of those, sorry, John, each one of those is carrying a cost, rightfully so, that we should pay. I'm not questioning that.
That goes all the way up.
It's going to go on for the next 50, 60 years.
Right, after the first couple of years, it was already at $3 trillion.
Right. And you don't have to be an MIT graduated master mathematician or actuarial expert to be able to extrapolate what those order of magnitude numbers are, and they're massive.
But you see, we were talking when Professor Detmer was last on, was why the people ignore Howard and say the mainstream historians. I've been thinking about that for 2 weeks, and maybe we all can have an opinion, but it's almost like history is almost... I was on a local radio show, and with, I'm the only veteran, I'm a disabled veteran, and I was with 3 patriots that are going to tell me what I should feel about this.
Were they Facebook patriots? Because there are more and more of those. What I call Facebook patriots, Facebook warriors, who sit on their couch at home.
No, not really. It was just, they have a right to that and everything. I was... it was different. It's different though. That World War II generation was very cynical that Howard came out of. You had all the great novels, and we're not going to get into the quality because of the World War One was that. But and then the Vietnam era. But people, you know, there's this myth about America, and that history is just this blue skies, and it's almost like a prospectus to buy into a Ponzi scheme. So if you're going to talk about certain realities, it just turns off, it turns off the marks. It turns off the mooches. I hate to say that, but, Reagan, with his show, which is, we got that MAGA, is, let's make America great. But he had the same stuff. Yeah, let's forget about Vietnam, which was a war and a stalemate, where we killed 58,000 American soldiers needlessly and 1 million East Asian peasants, and it just kept going on. Let's not think about those things. Let's not think about the crown jewels. Professor Detmer, when I watch Trump, I often think about how he is a product of the 70s and the revelations after the Vietnam War and the revelations about the CIA and the FBI. A secret government out there murdering people, Bobby Hampton and all sorts of people. COINTELPRO and that.
There was an interesting piece on public television yesterday, the day before, about talking about the Nixon administration. They were particularly it was Rachel Maddow was on talking about a piece that she has coming up, a podcast or something about Spiro Agnew and the Southern strategy and going down into Alabama during the midterms.
Yeah, I know about that.
But in this case, so she drew analogies to the Make America Great Again, and he's speaking about keeping America great.
Well,
and the other thread was attacking the press. And so, despite,
Yeah, of course. That was William Safire who wrote that stuff. The nattering nabobs of negativism.
So, and he talks about that he wouldn't be. Spiro Agnew says to a group of the Republic in Alabama, he says, I'm not going to be, this unwritten rule about we're not allowed to criticize the network TV commentators or the New York Times and the elite New York press. But I won't be afraid to do it, and then he goes on to condemn them. And this is, if you talk about where does Trump come from, there's a direct line back to there. This stuff works.
Yeah, but that's where the Jeffersonian press, we're forgetting about Professor Detmer, the Jeffersonian press, there was what was the book about John Adams, which I didn't like, by what's his name, who used to narrate stuff on PBS. Who's that historian that wrote about John Adams, Professor Detmer? McCullough?
Sure I know who you're talking about.
It's either McCullough or Ambrose.
Yeah, and that's, he's all sympathetic because poor John Adams, the Jeffersonian press, is saying that he's a eunuch and stuff. So let's slap their, keisters in jail. There's always been this tension between the press and politicians.
Right?
But when FDR went to the radio because 90% of the press was against him, Colonel McCormick of what was that newspaper in Chicago, the one that has famously, Truman loses or
right, yeah, Stevenson.
That was the Chicago
Tribune.
Yeah, Stevenson, wasn't
Colonel
it?
McCormick was publishing secrets to undermine the War Department and FDR just the day of Pearl Harbor. There was the isolationism in that. The things we're seeing now is not old-fashioned. Now, Howard, when we were with Howard, you wouldn't read the press. The press isn't going to give you, the mainstream press isn't going to give you.
So that brings us back to the avenues for...
Time magazine sold the war.
Right, but that brings us back to then, if we take that couple of thoughts, I think what I'm hearing is that, from the press, there's nothing new, right?
Sure.
They wrote...
Partisan Review, which was a left-wing... what was Partisan Review? It was left-wing. It was certainly not Trotskyite. It was anti-Stalinist. We found out it wound up at BU. It was funded by the CIA. A lot of the cultural organs of the Cold War were funded by the CIA.
Right, but going back to this idea about how one affects change, right, or how one impresses the public consciousness and makes an indent in some of this stuff. So if we box off the press and say that one thought is that that which we see today is sort of nothing new, that they are either conformist and establishment, or that they're ignored by many. So we go back to this idea about students, or if it's not going to be students, that activism and the idea of people taking action, and we've seen efforts at it. We had the organization, the Occupy movement, which we saw it on the Tea Party side. That was activism. That was well funded activism, and
by the Koch brothers.
carpet astroturfing. But we saw that. We saw then we saw the Black Lives Matter and the All Lives Matter and all this stuff sort of happen. But these have all been abortive efforts at getting having a major impact. You could claim that the Tea Party had a real impact on politics and policy and affected change, but on the left, and I'm talking about the mild left, anywhere, anywhere along that spectrum, or the centre, where is that going to come from? If it's not going to come out of university campuses, where is it going to come from?
Well, at Boston University, we had the underground press, which John Silber, he throttled the money for it.
Right.
He was going to throw me a...
and let me just say...
Professor Detmer, it's all... But, we're getting back to the thing where Howard Zinn, people don't want to talk about Zinn. They don't want to talk about somebody that's outside the mainstream of triumphalism.
But they have to know about him first, so to speak. And I know Professor Detmer is doing that with his book. But I'm looking at the byline here, going the battle over history and education, politics and scholarship.
Right.
And this battle is ongoing. There are people who are trying to create the narrative. And so, how does the counter narrative, or I would call it the truth, how does that, if it doesn't start from, there are two places, I think. College campuses and sort of,
academia and the press.
Well, I'm discounting the press and saying they're sort of in there. They're there. They're not going. It's not going to have change. So the other place, and I mentioned this the last time we spoke, has to do with sort of art and writing, right? So sort of art, great art, in whatever form, film, pictorial arts, writing, poetry. I don't care what you call it, but the arts sort of, so I think I mentioned the last time, sort of Pete Seegers of the world and people like that
where are they?
Like where are they? Where are the if
well, let's go let Professor Detmer have a few words, because we could filibuster the entire United Senate between the two of us.
Right. So
Professor Detmer,
right.
Have the floor.
Where's the Woodstock?
So as to the question of where this is going to come from, I don't know that I really have a good answer for it. I was just going to say that, there was some discussion about people ignoring Howard Zinn. That was certainly true for a long time. And then for reasons that aren't clear to me, over the last, 6 or 7 years, there have been just a whole lot of vicious attacks on him, rather than just ignoring him. So I think there's something of a battle to, if you will, kind of keep his view of history, out of the canon, to sort of label him as some kind of a nut, some kind of an outsider, not to be taken seriously.
Stalinist, a left-wing propagandist, which is not true.
Right.
I've seen the Stalinist thing laid on him, and but it's. Who defines reality now?
Well, we do, right? I mean, this is the thing. You talk about when you talk about activism. I think about back many years ago about sitting, on a university campus in various places. But I think about having discussions late into the night, which were in back then smoke-filled rooms, because that's what people did.
Smoke-filled with marijuana, or just cigarettes?
Never. Yeah, never.
Was, the latter.
Gambling at Rick's, never. Shocked. But anyway, but I remember, picking topics that were actionable, and we talked about things that were achievable.
Yeah.
And how.
Well, you're from Ireland.
Yeah. Yes. And so we would talk about, yes, the things we want. We all were agreed about the things we desired. But then we talk about how do we affect change. So we'd pick a topic that we were able to take action on, and then we worked on it on multiple fronts. And some was legislatively. We would approach individual politicians and say, because it suited there, and we would provide them, just like ALEC does, sort of provide documentation and support for politicians here. We'd provide information and talking points to somebody who would introduce a piece of legislation, and then we'd, in a very sort of nefarious way almost, but certainly in a non-public way, we'd go and approach the press, and we'd approach other things, and nobody could see it all coming from one set of hands. But what was happening is that, we were pushing this topic that we wanted to bring to fruition.
Are you talking about in Ireland?
In Ireland. And it might, this is a very small small place.
You had the old order that you had to get rid of.
We
1923.
We had to change a society which was based on sort of semi-Victorian, feudalism, and so we had to change everything from everything. There was every social change that hadn't happened. What happened through the civil rights movement in the United States and earlier.
But
we were facing
when you talk about civil rights, it's a change in consciousness and a change in the idea. Blacks. Howard was at Spelman College. We talked about it. African American women's college in a segregated city, Atlanta, which Eddie Edwards is from. My father lived in Atlanta from the 60s, off and on into the 80s, and. People talk about consciousness, but it's a real thing. So the other at that time, what women were thought of, what African Americans were thought of, what different ethnic groups were thought of. And there's been an evolution since then, but we're having a reaction that Professor Detmer, this is like the final reaction to what happened in 1964 with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Warren Court. Well, going back to 54, the 2 Brown v. Board of Education. Yeah, it's.
Well, let's hope it's the final reaction.
I think it's.
Yeah, it is a remarkable phenomenon. I think it's pretty clear. You guys were talking before about Trump and his slogan, "Make America Great Again." And so if you ask the question, he's saying it's not great now. When was it great? And so when you look at his policies and his rhetoric, it seems to have to do with, a time when it was a culture dominated by white men. And, you didn't have to deal with women and African Americans and Hispanics and all of that kind of thing.
Yeah, no immigration.
Amazingly, that seems to really resonate. I saw a poll just the other day that his approval numbers are back up around 45%. So almost half the country think he's doing a good job.
Well, he's out today, talking about the 14th Amendment, where he's revisiting the Dred Scott decision.
He's going to strike down the Constitution single-handedly.
No, but it's not funny though. I mean, I don't even think he knows the Dred Scott decision, but he's going back to visit these topics.
But Jim,
you're talking about when was it great again? Where does he want? Where does this go?
The 14th Amendment was the biggest in the Warren Court. They used the 14th Amendment to incorporate the Bill of Rights to the states. That was a huge battle, and there was a great reaction against that.
I don't believe that when the president said he's going to eliminate birthright citizenship by executive order. No, I understand that, but I think he knows that when he says it.
But he might have the court. Whatever the court says.
I think there's 2 different worlds here. There's the real world that you and I deal in, which is he can't do it and it would require constitutional change, and that's going to be very difficult to do. And then there are the people who will be at his rallies next week who support a guy who says, I'm getting rid of birthright citizenship.
But whatever the court says is, Jim, we were with Howard, we learned the slaughterhouse cases where the 14th Amendment was to protect the rights of African Americans. That was immediately thrown out by the courts. They didn't give a damn. And they used it to make corporations into citizens. And they got rid of the power of states to charter corporations. That's one of the big developments that allowed, the capitalism that came later, the Rockefeller type of conglomeration and that. The courts often take the laws and just turn it to their own ends. But the irony when you bring up Dred Scott was, up until Jackson, and Murray Levin studied Jackson. Anybody that was left studied Jackson because Andrew Jackson's the beginning of the modern democracy and the whatever evolution you are towards enfranchising people. And he put Taney on the court. The Marshall Court was an oligarchy that, when you actually go back and look at the history of the court and the decisions, you basically had an oligarchy that, hell with it, this is our country. This is how it's going to be, and you really don't have many rights. Taney, who would later, humiliate whatever his reputation is based on Dred Scott, one of the worst decisions, although it does come out of its time and the reasoning of the time, but it's repulsive, and Abraham Lincoln ran on the fact that that wasn't settled law, and you could overturn that decision by, just defying it. That was Lincoln.
So if you don't, what's the...
But the point is, Cheney and Jackson, they introduced a new system against this federalist oligarchy that's now being celebrated on Broadway in Hamilton, as reactionary a person as you can get. When I was a kid, we were singing about Thomas Jefferson in 1776 and stuff like that. But now.
So what is history? What is
History.
the title of the book? The battle over history and education, politics, and scholarship. So is
Schlesinger's
history?
great book was The Age of Jackson.
Professor? Is history then is it? I'm not just my personal. I'm not a big believer in cyclical. There's any kind of cyclical nature of history. But is there this sort of this pendulum type thing, which is an overreaction, moving to one side, and then a popular reaction to swing back? Is there some of that? Is that what we see over a couple of centuries?
Yes, I think there is some of that. For so long, it's been the case that, or was for so long the case, that history in the United States was completely triumphalist and celebratory.
Progressive.
It's all about what a great nation we are and how heroic and wise our leaders are. And out of the movements of the 1960s, there was some pushback against that. Howard Zinn's book, A People's History of the United States, sort of a major statement of this alternate view of history.
Yeah.
And that starts to gain a lot of ground. And now there is a tremendous pushback against that. And I see it all over the place. And not just among the right wing. Also,
amongst liberals, so-called liberals,
are sort of trying to restore this triumphalist view.
Yeah, they believe in this stuff. Look at how can anybody defend the Electoral College? Birch Bayh wrote an amendment, and in 1969, 3/4 of the House voted for the direct election of senators, because the 1960 election, nobody knows how many votes John F. Kennedy got, because in Alabama they had two different tickets running, a segregationist and a JFK. And in 68, when George Wallace was running, the beginning of the Southern strategy,
right,
the incredible success he had.
He carried 6 states.
They thought it would be a hung. Nobody would get a majority, Humphrey or Nixon, and then it would go into the House. And the electors of George Wallace approached Nixon and saying, if you guarantee us that you won't enforce the civil laws, the civil rights laws, particularly segregation and that, we will give you the Wallace votes. So that was an immediate reaction by a group of people. But you got to remember, in '64 there was a huge influx of Democratic liberal senators, of which Birch Bayh was, and he got washed out in 1980 in the Reagan thing. But there was. But the Southerners that controlled the Senate, very conservative, would not let it out of committee, because they wanted the Electoral College to have the ability to make a deal like that. And that's true. The Electoral College can do anything it wants. But we can't talk about that, Jim. We have to listen to Hillary Clinton in 2000. Oh, the Electoral College is wonderful. Because that's what people tell us. It doesn't make any sense. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make any sense. In England, they found, Tony Blair didn't do much, but they kind of reformed the House of Lords. But every place outside of Australia, which has probably the only real Senate outside the United States, does reforms like that. You don't have an upper house with that type of power, but not in the United States.
Right.
But we can never talk about it. If Howard talks about that, look at it. So undermines. The New York Times in 2000. We should not contest. He should not contest. Gore should not contest it because it will undermine the legitimacy.
Right.
I mean,
right.
And that was a tie. But this system doesn't work. It broke down in 1800 almost immediately, and you had to have amendments. They couldn't even elect the president.
But
and it broke down in the Civil War.
When you say that, and I have some sympathy for it, but by comparative analysis, you look at the breakdown of democracy, or the lack of democracy across the world and across the Western world, where it's true that we've seen reform happen. But we've seen revolution, and we've seen dysfunction, and we've seen oligarchy, and we've seen dictatorship, etc., more often than we've seen some civilized, democratically agreed upon reform. Right, so this is sort of in defense of the Great American Experiment kind of comment.
You mean the Great American Oligarchy?
Well, whatever it is, what we have today, right, with all its flaws, right, what we have today,
it doesn't work, Jim. Look who's the president. Look who's in power. Look
45% of people think it's working great.
But most of the people are brainwashed into believing this pablum.
I think the problem is most of the people are apathetic. That's the biggest issue. How do we get Howard Zinn and David Detmer's book into the hands and minds and readership of people?
But we're here in Manchester, where the union leader denounced, as engaged in McCarthyism when the professor from Ottawa was here. And
yeah. I you know what? Here's another thought. So I think the world though tilts quickly. I'm not married to the pendulum analogy, Professor Detmer. I just
Andre Vida Danton. Did you remember the movie? He's got the camera and the
pendulum going back and forth. but you know when
we know what's going to happen.
If you think about when Hillary Clinton ended.
No, that's enough to.
Well, I know you're not her biggest fan, but
when
Hillary Clinton finished, ended her role as Foreign Secretary, when she finished that role, she had a 65% approval rating.
And what does that mean?
Well, what I'm saying is that we manage, within a 4-year period, we go from a 65% approval rating to almost a persona non grata by the time you get into year 2 of the Trump presidency. So it just goes to illustrate the fact that there can be massive change. So if the Electoral College were the example here, you could see a dramatic shift. In a 4-year period, that would see.
Jim, you have a government that's completely set up to keep a tiny elite in power, and that's what it does. It does. It does it very well.
An interesting study done a few years ago. Maybe you guys have heard of it. The lead author was a Professor Gilens, Gilens, and what they did is he and his co-author. They did a study of the influence of public opinion on public policy, broken down by income. And they certainly expected to find what everybody knows, namely that the rich have way more influence on public policy than the non-rich. But the results were so extreme, it was really shocking. They found that the poorest 80%, not 8% or 0.8%, the poorest 4/5 majority had zero effect on public policy. If there's something where
I didn't
the
even think of that.
80% poorest majority disagree with the 20% richest, the 20% richest win 100% of the time. So that's both parties.
I believe
that blows me away. You know how cynical I am.
No, it doesn't blow me away.
I would think 50.
I think it makes. I think we know that already. We know that in terms of policy. We know that in terms. You go to a city. You go to any city, and the potholes are fixed in the part of the city where the people are paying the highest property tax.
Yeah, that's why you try to live near them.
So that's certainly. The other thing is when you look at sort of the electorate, right? So 50% of people don't vote at all.
The great bourgeoisie.
And so now you take your 80-20 number, and mirror it against the way people vote. So 50% don't vote at all. Of the remaining 50% in the United States, notionally it's divided into two 20s and a 10 that slides back and forth between the two 20s. So the 20% of the two. In that 50%, you got those two 20s, one of which is the richest 20%, and all they need is a couple. All you need is a couple of 22. Now, my point would be 22.5% of people of the total population can get you elected in America because half the people aren't voting.
Caesar said pecuniary power equals political power. If his uncle hadn't left him that fortune, we wouldn't even know who he was. Of course, he had genius too, the money and the genius.
Yeah.
But, as we're sitting here thinking, and I'm looking at the book, Professor Detmer, I'm just thinking, they don't want people to know what Howard taught us, that you can actually change a society, that you can actually go and affect change. They don't want people to know that.
Yeah.
But who's the great they?
Right.
It's just in there,
I think you're right about that. I don't think it rises to the level of an overt conspiracy where people are getting together in a room and thinking, let's keep the masses ignorant.
Right.
But I think it is. I think Howard used to use the term, which I've always really liked, the natural selection of accidents. And I think it's sort of like that. It's whenever something happens in education where people are starting to learn something and develop, some critical thought, there's an attempt to stamp it out. And so there's such an emphasis now on sort of job training. That's what the university is for. We don't want the humanities. We don't want philosophy. We don't want
music,
history.
poetry.
We don't want literature and art. And I think that really is part of it. All of those things foster critical thought, foster challenging the status quo, whereas just learning how to do a trade doesn't. So that's what they favor.
Right,
and it's and it's less trouble.
Right, we see that here in Manchester, and I've been railing against it would be the wrong thing, but it's because again it's a nuanced point of view. Obviously being a tradesperson is an honourable profession and can be very lucrative for people, and there are people who would be whose best when you think about the idea of highest and best use, so there are, in terms of property, in terms of people, like highest and best use for any given person might be this guy is going to be a great tradesperson. So our schools are doing more and more of that, and rightfully so. But it also though implies, and this has been my point, that it is arrogant and presumptuous to say that a kid who's interested in becoming a pipe fitter, by definition, has no interest in literature, in art, in music, in philosophy, in psychology. I don't take such a view of the. I
agree with you.
Of the tradesmen who come to visit my house. I met a gentleman the other day, and I've done a bit of reading in my life, and I met a tradesman the other day, and this guy had not just read, but understood, and had done a lot of thinking about all the great Russian writers and all the great works of French literature, and I was like, the guy never stopped. I'm thinking, this guy's unbelievable, and so it's a disservice to.
He made a lot more. He's going to make a lot more money as a tradesman than as an associate professor.
It's a disservice the word education means something more than job training and preparing oneself for the work world. I think it's preparing oneself to live a fulfilled and examined life.
J. Paul Getty always said the best education for a businessman was a liberal arts education, and to expose yourself to all aspects of life, so that you understood life rather than just business.
I've worked for CEOs who were graduates with French degrees, philosophy degrees, history degrees all over the place.
That you can understand life and the dynamics.
I know a lot of CT, chief technology officers, etc., who had technical degrees, but a lot of CEOs I knew. I think it's thinking back. The majority of them did not, and I worked in technology. The majority of them were not technology. They didn't start out in technology. They brought a broader range of skills, things like political science or philosophy or history or something. So,
well, Professor Detmer, we're getting towards like the last 10 minutes, and I was just thinking about a future topic if you'll come on, is the wars over history, because there's wars over history, and there was in Soviet Union where they would change history, and of course Orwell, 1984 and that.
Well, we have in states in the United States today. We have in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas.
Oh, the battle over school books.
The battle over school books, and so the battle about who's going to sit on the state education committee is having a bigger long term. That's where we're getting creationism from, and eliminating some people from the lexicon, so it doesn't get included. And some people are sort of pointed at that, and this battle goes on there, but.
I was thinking about, remember when the U Girls, the Young Organizers United, and Pat DeLong spoke about them, saying that you've got to give them this entree. We have these they're girls, they're from Africa, they're refugees, and they're experiencing racism here in. That's not entirely what they're. Entirely what their message is, but they have experienced racism, and under the last administration, it wasn't taken seriously, racism. We had somebody that drove the Office of Civil Rights out of a school board meeting in his belligerence. We won't get into all of that, but I remember Pat saying that these girls, you have to give them a place where they can go. Because in the state of New Hampshire, Professor Detmer, you can have on the school board student members. And in Litchfield, New Hampshire, which is 14,000 people, my father's hometown, they were given by George II, but the Depression brought us up here. They've had it since 1984. They've had one.
Right.
But here, they don't. And I remember Pat saying, you know, talking about, well, the outlet would be violence or something. I was surprised by Pat, but Pat's of our era where there was violence on campus. But, you know, there's the people. Do you want to teach them about Martin Luther King or stuff like that? Not the Martin Luther King that was sanitized for white people, but the one that was a radical and that was a rebel. Well, and what would that do?
We still live in a state which was last to
second to last
to make Martin Luther King a holiday. We have people who say to me on Labor Day, you know, I had a guy say to me a couple of years ago, I go to work and I work harder on Labor Day than any other day, just to, you know. So we have a public representative on a board in the city of Manchester who made that point about Labor Day and working harder than anybody else. Now that I come to think about it, so we have a lot of work to do. And
it should be May Day, Jim.
And a long
Haymarket.
Yeah. We have a long way to go and a lot of work to do, but you know, I retain hope, and I think so long as we're resilient.
Oh, we have to.
And yes, and not I mean, it's awful to just even talk about hope. But I think, you know, as an example, as we come to the end of this, you think about how things can change and change quickly. The Me Too movement, and you could spend, you know, we could spend a day of programs on the Me Too movement, its origins and its development. And we are in the middle of the storm, or whatever that is, of the Me Too movement. We haven't found where it will all settle yet, right? This is in a state of flux. But there's no questioning, but there has been, for all that the women's rights movement and feminism and other things, and the steps forward that have been taken over time, this last 2 years is a new step. We're on another rung of the ladder around the Me Too movement.
Yes.
There has been a removal of a whole, it was unthought of that people like Matt Lauer and Feinstein, all these other people who could even have been touched, Robert Ailes and everybody
we have
else.
somebody here that, we have our own Harvey Weinstein here.
We do, but the point is,
and it's being suppressed, but I'm suppressing it.
Right.
So is the WMUR and the union leader.
But that's back to local, and we'll see again. You know, New Hampshire maybe the tide will wash up here later. But the point is, there is social change happening, and mores are changing, and people's
Jim, here,
behaviors.
And we can bring Press Detmer. The thing would be, if we use Howard Zinn and the activism, is this is a time, a wedge. You know, not what we use wedge issue, but wedge, and almost like there's wedges when the infantry attacks or the tanks, where you could use this to start opening up doors, like in the South where Howard was there with the girls and sending them out to protest about civil rights and support King and the other people down there that would wind up murdered. There's some, you know. But in our city, this is what we're dealing with now. We don't have a Human Rights Commission. Lewiston, Maine does, who has a mayor that would make our former mayor look like, you know, Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm when it came to racial issues and stuff. But in this town, there's no commitment whatever to doing what I would call doing the right thing.
But, you know, let's be also. You know, there's a generational change and a social change.
But where is the change?
It's coming.
See, here's the thing. But it doesn't. I don't see it. I don't see any of these state reps. They don't do anything. They don't talk about the issues.
Yeah, there's a new generation coming. I hope
they talk about what Ray Buckley tells them to do.
There's a new generation in business. I think there's a new generation coming in
business, of course,
coming in politics too.
But we're talking about Manchester, New Hampshire right now. We just had swastikas. We have a alderman, like I said. You know, and we have Gerard, who I would say that's a racist. Right. I'm not going to mince my words about him.
I think these are
why don't people use these opportunities?
Yeah. I think these are the last threshings of a large fish on the line. I think sort of Hemingway asked the old man in the sea, you know, this fish has been hauled in whether it likes it or not, and it's protesting very hard right now.
Still got 7 votes. We'll see what happens.
So we'll see. You know, it's a reaction to these things, and But
that Joe Lavassa can say stuff like that, and nobody says anything. Right. But why don't we have a Human Rights Commission? The great liberals of the city, they don't do anything.
I don't know where the great liberals of the city are. I'd like to kind of
we'll talk about that afterwards.
I've only got 10 fingers. I don't know where I get them. But anyway.
You have any last thoughts, Mr. Detmer, Professor Detmer? You always get sucked into our local conversation.
Well, going back to this point about the Me Too movement, I mean, if we're trying to have a note of optimism, I think that is a good point. I think that does show that things can change, and they can change kind of quickly where you don't really see it coming. I mean, there are lots of examples of that. I'll give you an example that it means something to me. Okay. It just so happens that I'm someone who's very sensitive to secondhand smoke. And, when I was a child back in the 60s and a teenager in the 70s, people just smoked all the time. And I would sometimes say, I think it's kind of unfair that I have to breathe all this secondhand smoke. And I remember adults would always laugh at me and say, oh, you're a dreamer. You think the world should conform to your little philosophy. And they kind of make fun of it. But now that battle has been pretty much won. Now, people are given the right to be free of having to breathe secondhand smoke. So that's an example. The Me Too thing is an example. Okay. Attitudes toward, gays and lesbians have changed.
Oh, yes,
in recent years.
You only got about a minute.
So so hopefully it can happen in other areas too. That was my only point.
You gave me a thought. Why don't maybe we can telecommute you. We could have a seminar for like the U girls or somebody. The history of how it happened in the South and stuff, and where the people did change. And that would be a good because those girls made me feel hope.
Right. Yeah, and I have great hope, and I know dealing with I spent this weekend on a university campus upstate, and
well, Jim, we gotta go. We gotta go now. I got some $2 bills that we're going to be handing out to buy votes. Who are your favorite candidates?
Yeah. All right.
Well, thank you, Professor Detmer. We'll call you. I'll be calling you again. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Right. So,
but it is, when talking to you guys, it is, because I think about them and the example of that. And when I brought up Pat, because Pat knows about the history and what happened. Right. And
when I see a kid from Central High School on CNN 2 weeks ago, talking nationally at 20 years old, I see the guy who's right behind him, the valedictorian from Central last year, so he was the one from the year before, is down at Harvard. That kid's at Harvard. This other kid is at Harvard. They're writing for the Harvard Crimson. They're making an impact. They have things to say. Their voices are being heard.
What happens to those Harvard boys, though? Well, they never grow up.
Well, maybe that's true, too. But I'm just saying, and it isn't about Harvard. I mean, it can be Plymouth State. It can be NHTI. It can be SNU. It can be, I don't want to be elitist about that. But there are, any time you worry about the current generation and where they're going and everything else, it's true. If you go into some pool bar on some side street, there are guys in there playing pool and hanging out. There are also people working in business and on trades and in university. There are a lot of smart young people out there.
Well, thank you for being here tonight. You helped me get through all my trials and tribulations.
Another day.
Let's see if we can affect some change in the next year in Manchester, some positive change.
There we go, positive change.
Take care. I probably won't be here next week. Might be up in Canada.
Affecting change.
Far away.
All right.
Yeah, in Montreal.
Good night, folks. Thank you.
In Montreal going, no.
You've done real good.
Me, Hat? Wait till I pass the whole test before he tells me I'm too old. Should have remembered my wig. But when are you coming back?
Whenever it's time, Ma.
Don't seem right to leave a old lady alone. And what about my goddamn license? Oh, it's just...
Why didn't you tell him you wear glasses?
None of this goddamn business what I wear. Just wear them to read anyway.
Was there anything else?